Hey everyone, and welcome to the Father, Son, and Holy Scriptures podcast, where we relate biblical teaching to our modern day lives.
I'm Dave. I'm Jake's father.
And I'm Jake. I'm Dave's son.
And we have our YouVersion Bible app here, so we're ready to go.
Alrighty. And so to kind of recap where we've been at here recently, we've been walking for a while here through the Old Testament. We've been seeing the people of Israel wander further and further away from God, starting with Moses leading the people out of Israel, all the way up till last episode we were talking through the book of Ezekiel, where we kind of pointed out what we think is one of the lowest points for the Israelites in the whole Bible. Ezekiel's kind of just a book of doom and gloom, darkness and unhappiness, just really not a great time for the people of Israel. Pretty hopeless for the Israelites.
Yep.
But luckily, this week we're looking at a little bit of a brighter time here for Israel. We're looking through the book of Daniel. It's really kind of a turning point. It does start at a pretty low spot. Even, in fact, the very first verse is in the year of the third reign of Joachim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it.
Right.
So it doesn't start off in a super great spot. We are still being besieged at the very beginning. But throughout the book, we actually see a lot of great examples of God taking care of the people that he's scattered to the corners of these nations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like that you said this is kind of a turning point. I mean, in fact, the book, if you're following along in the Bible, the book right before Daniel is actually Ezekiel. So this is kind of this historic account of this hardship, this difficulty that the people of Israel have been facing because, again, of their disobedience. They're wandering from God. And as a result, the king of Babylon comes in and takes over the people of Israel, right? This is where it starts. Give you a little bit more background on the book of Daniel. Just the book itself is 12 chapters long. It's broken into two different sections, interestingly, and they're really completely different writings, different writing style, different type of writing. I think a different meaning altogether. The first part, more like stories that happen over a 70-year period in Daniel's life. The second part is really different. It's dreams and visions that Daniel has during this same 70-year period, during the reigns of different kings. In fact, when you look at those chapters, you see he references these dreams in a timeline based on who's king of what nation and things like that. And they overlap. So the first 6 chapters kind of take place over 70 years. The next 6 chapters sort of go back and then take place over 70 years as well. In this podcast, we're only going to focus on the first 6 chapters. That's that story-like section. And we're going to leave the really more prophetic dream and vision to another time. In fact, a lot of that chapter 8, chapter 11, and 12 is really end times type of dreams and visions. And our plan is to, at some point, do a 3-part podcast on the end times. What does the end times look like? And we're going to include these chapters from the latter part of Daniel in there. But that gives you a little bit of breakdown on what the book itself looks like.
Yeah, another kind of neat thing that I thought I found about the book of Daniel was it actually has 2 authors. Not only is Daniel one of the authors of his own book, but Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is one of the authors. He writes the chapter 4 in the book of Daniel. I thought that was kind of neat.
We'll get to the king that's besieging them?
Yeah, the king that takes over Jerusalem.
Writes part of Daniel's book?
Writes part of Daniel's book, which I thought was kind of neat. And so we'll get to more about that chapter here in a little bit. The other kind of neat thing that I thought that we found about Daniel was one of the only Bible characters we could think of that nothing negative is said about Daniel throughout the whole story. Daniel's a pretty upright guy. And in fact, at one point he even says, no fault was found in him with God. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of neat that Daniel is just a good dude the whole time.
Yeah. And we see that. So Daniel is actually ranked one of 4 of the major prophets in the Bible. Major just because of the size of their writing. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, those are the 4 major prophets. And there's actually 8 copies of the book of Daniel that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1946 and 1956. Original, very, very old scrolls were found in the Middle East. And we have 8 complete copies of the book of Daniel that were found there, some original writings there. That's a pretty interesting piece.
I think it's interesting, like 8 copies.
Yeah, right.
It must have been a really popular book.
Well, when you think about it, it probably was a pretty popular book. I think Daniel was a pretty popular guy, actually. A lot of people knew about Daniel. Daniel's referenced in other places in the scriptures, actually. He's referenced in Hebrews, I know. There's this great Hebrews chapter 11. It's considered like the faith chapter, where a lot of people are referenced as people of faith. Moses and Noah and so many other people are referenced in Hebrews chapter 11 by name. But they even sort of reference that there was a guy of faith who survived the mouth of lions. We see in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 33, kind of referring to Daniel.
Yeah, I think my favorite reference to Daniel that I actually found was back in Ezekiel, which somehow we managed to miss last month when we were doing the episode on Ezekiel.
We did.
But in Ezekiel 14, there's even a reference to Daniel when the Lord is talking about destroying Jerusalem. He says, "Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and break its supply of bread and send famine upon it, I cut it off from the land." I cut it off from man and beast. Even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver by their own lives their righteousness, declares the Lord. So God even calls out Daniel as one of the only people who he would save when he destroys Jerusalem. Even if those three, some of God's most righteous people, were in Jerusalem, they'd only be able to save themselves.
Yeah. So Daniel, known as a person of faith out of Hebrews 11, Daniel known as a righteous man, right out of Ezekiel. In fact, I think it's referenced 2 times there in Ezekiel 14. Daniel being one of the maybe 3 only people I would save. The name Daniel, actually the Hebrew name is God is judge. And I think that's pretty interesting because we're going to see a number of stories in the book of Daniel that illustrate the fact that God looks out for people of faith, righteous people, those people that fear God and humble themselves. God is looking out for those kind of people. And we're going to see that in the book of Daniel. We actually see Daniel as he is brought into the Babylonian culture. He's actually given another name by the king of Babylon, Belteshazzar, which is the name that he's given by King Nebuchadnezzar. And it's actually a name that means Bel, which is a Babylonian god, will protect your life. Or basically, Belteshazzar means God, small g, will protect your life. And I think that's kind of interesting how Daniel, is a Hebrew name that means God, capital G, Yahweh is judge. But then also even the Babylonian name talks about God or a God or something is going to protect your life. And we really kind of see that playing out in the book of Daniel. It's a great example of God fulfilling like his promise to all along watch over the remnant, keeping and protecting his people, even throughout Ezekiel and other prophets that God was making these promises. As you mentioned at the top of the podcast, Jake, one of the main themes throughout Daniel is that, and I would phrase it like this: God opposes the proud, but he shows favor to the humble. And I choose those words because they show up in Proverbs 3:34. But I think that theme really plays out in the book of Daniel. And, I think that God also provides for those people that are faithful and just. And he's just in doing that. Like he is a righteous judge as he is protecting those who are faithful and righteous.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the first places that we see God covering Daniel under his protection is right at the very beginning. Like I said, the very first verse is Nebuchadnezzar sieging Jerusalem and taking over Jerusalem. And in this siege, Nebuchadnezzar goes through and he has his men collect 10,000 of the people of Jerusalem from the royal family and the nobility. And he says specifically he wants youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful and in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. So the men of the king go around and they collect 10,000 people, including Daniel and 3 of his friends, who are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Three names that I barely recognize, but I know them as Radshak, Meshach, and Abednego. But today I learned, just before recording this episode, that the last name is not Abednego. My entire life, I've always thought that. It is actually Abednego. The D and the N are switched. I had no idea.
Yeah. Who knew?
But yeah, so Nebuchadnezzar has all these people gathered up, and he actually provides for them. He offers them teaching in the literature and language of the Chaldeans, who are the Babylonians, a daily portion of the food that the king eats and the wine that he drinks, and they're educated for 3 years. And then at the end of that time, they're supposed to stand before the king. And during this time, Daniel meets with the men who have captured him. And he basically says, I'm not allowed to eat the king's food because I'm a Jew and that's unclean food. The God has said we're not allowed to eat it. And he requests basically to be fed vegetarian diet. The chief of the men says back to him, though, I fear my lord the king, who assigned you food and drink, for why he should see that you were in the worse condition than the youths of your own age. So you would endanger my head with the king?
Right.
I love that. He's worried about his own back. He's like, look, I know you've got your diet and everything like that.
Your convictions, sure, your faithfulness.
You gotta stay in good health, because if you're not healthy, the king's gonna be mad at me. And so Daniel says, give us a test then. For 10 days, let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then test our appearance against the other youths who are drinking the king's wine and eating the meat. And so they're given this test, and it says they were, at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than the youths who ate the king's food. And so God gave them the sustenance they needed, just eating the vegetables and drinking the water, less good food than all the others were eating. But they were actually found to be fatter in flesh and better in appearance than everyone else.
Yeah, quote unquote good food, right? That everybody else was eating.
Right.
Like the tasty morsels.
Not what God said to be eating.
Yeah. No, that's a great example of God sustaining them because of their faithfulness. They wanted to maintain their tradition and their conviction of what God has said is good to eat and what it's not good to eat. Another great example is this whole idea of visions. Not only did God give Daniel the ability to see visions of the future, which again is part of the last part of the chapter or the book itself, but he also gave Daniel the ability to interpret dreams of other people. In fact, in chapter 2, the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, has a dream, and he's very troubled. In fact, in 2 verse 1, it says, in the second year of his reign, King Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, astrologers, basically everybody, to tell him what he dreamed. When they came in and stood before him, he said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, and they said, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll interpret it for you. Which, that seems pretty logical. Like, hey, the king has had some dreams. He's troubled by it. He calls all sort of these people that are interpreters, and they say, well, let us know what the dream is, and we'll interpret it. The king replied to them in verse 5, this is what I have firmly decided. I love this part. If you do not tell me what my dream was, and then interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble.
I love that. What a ridiculous request.
Nebuchadnezzar was a pretty fiery guy. He was pretty intense. I can imagine that being around King Nebuchadnezzar was kind of a pretty excitable thing to be around him, Yeah. So he says to them, listen, I'm not going to tell you what my dream was because you might fake it. You might just make some stuff up. And so what you're going to do is you're going to tell me what my dream was, and then you're going to interpret it for me. Otherwise, I'm going to cut everybody into pieces, all you people. That's a pretty broad stroking statement there.
I hope someone can get it right.
Right? And they reply, there is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any of his magicians, enchanters, or astrologers. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, they say, and they do not live among us. This made the king very angry and furious, and he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon, including, remember who had kind of been brought up into the council of Babylon? That's right, Daniel and his buddies. So this decree goes out that the the guards are supposed to collect all the magicians, all the wise men, everybody, the astrologers, everyone, Daniel, all his friends, because they're all going to get executed because nobody could tell the king what his dream was. Daniel says to the guard that comes to get him, he says, why is everybody so intense? What's going on? The guard says, well, this is what's happened. And so therefore we're ordered to kill everybody. So Daniel pleads with the guy and he says, give me just a couple of days and I'll be able to interpret the dream. So he goes home and he talks to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his buddies, and he urges them to plead for mercy from God to be able to interpret, to be able to hear the dream and then interpret the dream. And it says in Daniel chapter 2, verse 19, during the night, the mystery of the dream was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the Lord of heaven and said, praise to you, the name of God, forever and ever. Wisdom and power are yours. You are the one who changes the seasons. You set up kings and you depose them. You give wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. And he goes on just praising God there. And so with this, the next day, Daniel and his buddies wake up and they go before the king. And the king asks them, hey, are you able to tell me what the dream is and able to interpret it? And I absolutely love Daniel's reply here. This is in chapter 2, verse 27. Daniel replies, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery that he asks about. So he basically, when he's asked, can you interpret this dream? Can you tell me what the dream is? Daniel says, nope, I can't. But then he goes on to say, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Like he has told me what's happening and I will be able to interpret the dream. And then Daniel goes on to explain the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, where there's this statue basically in front of him. He says, you looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its legs of iron. Its feet partially iron and partially baked clay. While you were watching, a rock cut out, not by human hands, struck the statue on its feet and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken into pieces at the same time and became like chaff on the threshing floor. This is the dream that you were given, and now I will go ahead and interpret it. And then Daniel goes on to interpret it, and he says that King Nebuchadnezzar is actually the head of gold. That God set him up as the king over all the earth, and other kings were going to come before him. But the stone that came out, that wasn't cut by human hands, but cut by godly hands, was going to come and strike the kingdoms and establish its kingdom forever and ever. And I love this section because in chapter 2, verse 44, it says, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor never be left to another people. It will crush all the other kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever. And many people interpret this section as Daniel really pointing towards Jesus, ushering in a new kingdom, not a kingdom of kings, not a kingdom of human leaders, or even a kingdom of rules and regulations and laws, but a kingdom of grace and mercy of God. Again, referencing that rock that was cut out of the mountain, not by human hands, but of godly hands that crashed all the other kingdoms down. So again, I love that section because it's sort of the book of Daniel pointing towards a time of hope, not of oppression, not of kings pressing people down, but God has given Daniel the vision and the interpretation of this vision to offer the people hope, not only protecting Daniel, not only opposing the proud, but giving grace to the humble like Daniel, but also pushing forward into the future and looking towards Jesus, the one who ultimately is giving hope to all people, all those who humble themselves before God.
Yeah, one of the things I actually really love about that story is Daniel is given this ability to interpret these dreams. This is the first example we see of it, is this dream of Nebuchadnezzar, but it actually mentions it in chapter 1 that in 17, Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. God gave him that gift. Mm-hmm. And so Daniel has this ability to interpret dreams and understand these visions like this. And he hears a guard comes to him and says, all the wise men in Babylon have to be killed because nobody can interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Like,
Right.
here's the situation. Nebuchadnezzar's not telling anyone what his dream is, and he's killing all the wise men because nobody can tell him what his dream is and interpret it.
Right.
And without knowing anything about the dream, Daniel says, "Oh, set me up at the meeting."
Right.
Right? Like, God has given me this gift. God can interpret this dream.
Yeah.
Right? He doesn't even know what it is yet. He has no idea what's going on. Before he even goes home and tells his friends, before they even start talking to God about it, before he's shown what the vision is at all, he says, yeah, like, set me up with a meeting with the king. We'll figure it out.
That's faithfulness.
Right? I love the faithfulness of Daniel in that.
Yeah.
In fact, there's another dream that Nebuchadnezzar has here in Daniel. It's in chapter 4. Which is that chapter I was talking about that's written by Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house, prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid as I lay in bed. The fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known the interpretation of the dream. This time, however, he offers to tell them what it is.
Well, that's good, yeah.
Which is
Not
good.
quite
He's
as
being a little bit
intense.
more reasonable now.
Yeah, yeah.
But they could not make known to me its interpretation. At last, he says, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Both of those are small g's.
Yeah.
And I told him the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Tell me the visions of my dream that I saw, and their interpretation. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven. It was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, Chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives to it whom he will, and sets over the lowliest of men. And so Daniel goes through and he interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, My Lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and fruit abundant, it is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominions to the end of the earth. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, come down from heaven and say, Chop down the tree, this is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of the heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will.
You are the tree, right?
And so it doesn't seem like Nebuchadnezzar has really learned his lesson from his last dream that he had, where he is the golden head of this figure that's going to be crushed. But again, we have another Nebuchadnezzar dream where he is some sort of figure, this time a tree, that is going to be chopped down.
Right. You know, I love that there's, he has a dream of a big giant statue. He has this dream, he's the golden head of the statue, right? And in this dream, he's this tree where all the birds are able to, put their, find their nests, and all the animals find their protection. I think that's interesting. He must have been a pretty great king, that's for sure. And he had quite a bit of pride, didn't he?
Yeah, in fact, so much pride that Nebuchadnezzar ignores the warning from Daniel. He doesn't pay any attention really to what's coming for him. And one of these days, it says here in in verse 28, at the end of the 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, Is this not great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? And while the words were still on the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And Nebuchadnezzar goes and spends, it doesn't say exactly how long,
7 seasons.
7 periods of time.
7 periods of time. Completeness. 7 is typically a number that would signify a complete period of time, like enough time. a complete time to do the work that's needed.
Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar goes out and is living on the land, foraging for food, eating the grass. He wakes up and there's dew on him in the mornings. And so for the 7 periods of time, Nebuchadnezzar wanders around eating grass like an ox. And then at the end of the 7 periods of time, Nebuchadnezzar stands up and he says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will amongst the host of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? And when he realizes that, as it was said earlier, the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives to whom he will, it says that his reason returned to him, and for the glory of his kingdom, his majesty and splendor returned to him. Nebuchadnezzar's counselors and lords sought him out, and he was reestablished in his kingdom for a period of time.
Yeah. I love that chapter 4. In fact, Daniel is actually one of my absolute favorite books of the Bible because there's so much here. Again, there's stories, these stories of Daniel interpreting dreams. There's prophetic dreams that Daniel himself has in the latter part of the book itself. And then there's this section here, Daniel chapter 4. It starts off and it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar's writing this. It's almost like his journal, or he's writing this down for people to come so that they'll know, like, this is his testimony. Like Nebuchadnezzar is writing his testimony down. He's saying there was a time where, I was really proud. I lived like this. I thought like this. This guy Daniel came by. He interpreted this dream for me that God had basically shown me and given Daniel the explanation for. And it revealed to me that I was living in pride. I was acknowledging, or I was figuring on the fact that I was a god. And it really wasn't until he says in verse 34, at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, right? Again, he's giving his own testimony. I raised my eyes towards heaven and my sanity was restored. That's what the NIV says. And then I praised the Most High God. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. And I just love this because it is like Nebuchadnezzar's personal testimony. He didn't really get it. He saw God, Yahweh, doing a lot of great things around him. He saw dreams coming true. He saw the power of God in Daniel. In fact, it even says, he named him what he named him because he thought the powers of the gods were in Daniel, but he just misinterpreted it. He thought it was the power of his own Babylonian gods. And it wasn't really until this point in time that he acknowledged the power of Yahweh, of God. And again, just another great example of God opposing the proud, but giving grace to the humble. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled, and God showed grace to Nebuchadnezzar. And I love that. He was a Babylonian king, right? He wasn't a Jewish king. He wasn't a Christian king. He wasn't a follower of Jesus. He was sort of this pagan Babylonian king, and yet God showed grace and mercy on him because he was humbled. He humbled himself, and he acknowledged God for who he was. The next story sort of in that section, chapter 5, is about a king Belshazzar, which is different than Belteshazzar, which is Daniel's name. That's why we like to just call him Daniel, because it's easier to say as well. But there was King Belshazzar, which was the son of King Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar was having this great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. He drank wine with them. And while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and all of his nobles, his wives, his concubines, all of them might drink from those goblets. And this Belshazzar, obviously he didn't learn anything while his father was missing for 7 periods, whether it's 7 years or how long that was. His son Belshazzar didn't learn anything about humbling himself because he's partying with 1,000 of his nobles. It says his wives, his concubines, they're all in the same room together. You can kind of see this guy's probably at the center of attention, and he's caught up with wine, and he's just playing this role of this proud king of kings. And he's like, yeah, even bring all the goblets that we took from the temple of this Hebrew God Yahweh. Bring those goblets in here because we're just going to party and drink with all those. And then it goes on to say, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way, right? So he was playing the big man. He was partying with all of his 1,000 friends and all these other people and stuff like that. But when this hand shows up, which I'm going to say was the hand of God, when the hand shows up and starts writing some things on the wall, this guy turned pale, his knees were knocking, and he was terrified. You ever heard the phrase, the writing is on the wall? That's where this phrase comes from. Because basically when somebody's like, hey man, the writing's on the wall, it's like there's no going back now. Like it's a done deal kind of a thing. And I feel like King Belshazzar knew exactly what was happening. The king called out for his enchanters and astrologers, this is in verse 7, and his diviners, and he brought those people and the wise men together, and he said, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in all of the kingdom. So again, here's this proud guy, he sees this writing on the wall, he calls for anybody and everybody to figure out what this dream means. But the queen, hearing the voice of the king and all of his nobles, she came into the banquet hall, and she said, O king, live forever. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods. Now, again, this is the spirit of the Babylonian gods because everybody's kind of misinterpreting Daniel's power. She says, in the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of no other gods. So call him in. This is Daniel she's referring to. Call him in and see what he has to say. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give all these rewards to somebody else. Don't have to offer me anything, he said, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to interpret what has been written on the wall.
Interestingly there, real quick, I just thought it was kind of neat. My Bible makes a note here where it says the queen. It actually also makes a note that could be the queen mother, which would have been Nebuchadnezzar's wife. So that may not be Belshazzar's wife. It may be his mom, which I thought was kind of interesting.
That is
trying
interesting.
to give him some sort of advice. Like, your dad used to go to Daniel all the time.
Right.
You should talk to this guy. He interpreted his dreams. He was great. Call Daniel.
It's interesting. I didn't ever see that before, but it says that Belshazzar was partying with all of his wives, all of his concubines. Like basically all of his friends were there, but she wasn't. So this could very well be the queen mother, right? Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Belshazzar's mom.
Yeah, thought that was kind of neat.
When's the last time you invited your own mom to a party that you had with all your friends?
I don't think ever.
There you go. You and Belshazzar, right? So yeah, Daniel shows up and he says, O king, the most high God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, there's this pride thing again. Daniel's talking about Nebuchadnezzar. But when his heart was hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people, given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of the heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets them over anybody over anyone that he wishes. And I love that section because Daniel is talking to this guy who's really living this full-on pride life. Like Belshazzar is like, hey man, I've got this. I'm doing it. I'm living, he says like kind of my best life right now with 1,000 of my closest friends, but I've got this situation I need help with. And Daniel reminds him of his dad. And he says, hey, listen, your dad was the king above all kings. Like he had it all. He had everything going on. And it was taken away from him until he humbled himself. But then he goes on in Daniel chapter 5, verse 22 to say, but you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. So here we even see Belshazzar was there during all that time where Nebuchadnezzar was deposed from his kingdom. He saw all of that happening. He saw his dad disappear. And yet he saw also his dad come back and his testimony. Makes me believe that Belshazzar probably knew Daniel chapter 4, right? He knew his dad's testimony. So Daniel says, you have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. And then he goes on to say, the inscription that was written is Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And if you want to know what those exact words are, go to your Bible, open up Daniel chapter 5, and you'll see them there. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And this is what these words mean, Daniel said. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, like it's been parsed up or divided up. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. I guess if nothing else, Belshazzar at least kept his word. I imagine he was still pretty afraid though, because Daniel laid out a pretty heavy verdict on this guy with the writing on the wall.
What else happened to Belshazzar?
Well, it says that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius, the Mede, took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So Daniel tells him right up front, hey, your kingdom is divided. It's already been taken away from you. And who's it going to be given to? The Medes and the Persians. And lo and behold, that very night, he's killed. And Darius, the Mede, is actually the one who takes over the kingdom.
Yeah, and at this point, it's been some time that Daniel has been in Babylon, which leads me to one of my favorite stories, actually, with Darius from the book of Daniel. Darius takes over as king after Belshazzar here. At this point in time, since Daniel's capture, it's been like around 60 years. He was captured as like a young man in his late teens, early 20s. He he works under Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar for a while here. And then when Darius takes over, he's in like his 80s.
Right.
And Darius, being a pretty smart guy, he's a ready leader for the kingdom. He decides he's going to set up some government staff. And so he sets up 120 what are called satraps.
Governors.
Or
right?
governors, yep. And then over them he sets 3 presidents, of which Daniel is one of those 3 presidents. And there's basically just a government structure to help Darius keep an eye on the kingdom. And in fact, Daniel was picked, it says, because he had an excellent spirit in him. And the king had plans to set him over the whole kingdom, but the other presidents and satraps wanted to find some sort of ground for complaint against Daniel. And in fact, this is that part that I was referencing to earlier where it says, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Daniel was a pretty outstanding guy.
Right.
And so the rest of these satraps and presidents, they get a plan together and they go to Darius and they say, "Oh, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions." Darius says, "Sounds like a pretty great idea. I love this plan. I love getting worship." And so King Darius signs the documents and the injunctions. And when Daniel hears about everything that had been signed, he goes to his own house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. And so Daniel hears about the new law and doesn't do anything about it,
Right.
which is pretty great. Daniel's been praying 3 times a day in his window that faces towards Jerusalem ever since he's been here in Babylon.
And he just goes back to doing
He's
it.
been doing that for 60 years.
Right. That's faithful, man.
I love that.
I love that.
That's sweet, man. And so even in the face of this, his boss's new rule, the king's new rule, that anyone worshiping anyone other than King Darius for the next 30 days shall be thrown into a den of lions.
Right.
Daniel goes home, opens his window towards Jerusalem, and kneels down and prays 3 times a day.
You know, the other thing I see here is, Daniel didn't, Daniel didn't like make a big sign and protest and get all angry and get out in the street and scream about this is unfair and like all kinds of other things. Like he didn't really, I don't see it here at least. He didn't like create this public scene. He heard the rule and he just went back and was sort of quietly faithful to God like he'd been for 60 years. He just kind of went back doing the thing that he'd been doing for a long time, being faithful to the Lord.
Yeah. And so some of those other governors end up catching on to what Daniel's doing. And they go back to Darius and they say, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you shall be cast into the den of lions?" And the king says, "Yeah, that's exactly what I did." It says, in fact, "The thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked."
Can't be undone.
And then they tell him, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." And I think this was an interesting part that I wasn't really expecting when I was reading through this again. It says, "The king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to try and rescue him." So the king realizes, like, oh, I've been tricked, right, by everyone else. Like, Daniel's a great leader. He's upset that he's going to lose Daniel to this decree that he has signed that cannot be undone because it is the law of the Medes and the Persians. So yeah, he goes to Daniel, and unfortunately he basically tells Daniel, like, "Listen, man, I signed the law. Like, my hands are tied. We've got to, like, punishment is punishment. You got to do it." But he declares to Daniel, he says, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you," before lowering Daniel into a den of lions and then rolling a stone in front of it.
Like pats him on the bum and says, "Good luck."
Yep. He's like, "Hey, man, like, I'm really sorry. I signed this law. I really didn't think about it too hard. I know you're like the right-hand guy around here, but you got to go in this hole.
Oops.
With hungry lions, and then we're going to put a rock on top of it."
Right.
And so they roll the stone over, and it actually says the king seals the stone with his own signet ring. And then he goes home. The king went back to his palace, spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. And then at the very break of day, the king arose, went with haste to the den of lions. And as he comes near to the den where Daniel was, he cries out in a tone of anguish. He says, "O Daniel, servant of the living God," capital G God, "has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And Daniel says back to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you. O king, I have done no harm." And then it says the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the lion's den, and no kind of harm was found in him, because he had trusted in his God. And this is one of those things that I feel like gets passed over on the story a lot of times, especially when we see like the VeggieTales version of Daniel in the lion's den.
Right.
But it goes on here in chapter 7, verse 24 to say, "And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces." And so these presidents and satraps and governors tried to get one over on Daniel and tried to get one over ultimately on God. And it ends with, before they even hit the ground in the lion's den, all of their bones were broken to pieces.
Bad things happen to the bad people, right?
It's crazy. And I think it's really neat, actually. Here in chapter 6, we see Darius's reply to everything that has happened. And I thought it was really similar to Nebuchadnezzar's reply that he gives after his time of insanity. He says, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who saved Daniel from the power of the lions." I just thought it was cool how Daniel's worked for 3 kings now.
Right.
Either interpreting dreams or messages no one else can read, or surviving situations that no one else would be able to.
Right. That's a pretty hopeless situation. You're getting thrown into a cave with like
Hungry lions.
Yeah, lions that are going to devour you. What are you going to do in that situation? And yet God saves him from that, right?
And each time the kings realize, like, this is the power of Yahweh God.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't any Babylonian god. This isn't Bel, right? This
Right.
is Yahweh God. And we see that a lot of the times all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted. And the Lord is ruler over all.
I think that's pretty amazing because everybody recognized there was something special about Daniel, right? Whether that's the queen mother, she saw it. She said, hey, there's some special spirit in Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar saw it. Here we see Darius saw it, right? They all see there's something special about Daniel. And it wasn't because he was all like flamboyant with his gift, right? He wasn't, again, out in the public square screaming and shouting and draw attention to himself. He was just faithfully worshiping God. He had convictions. Back in the beginning, we talked about his convictions of eating what is right, the food that God had directed them to eat. Daniel was just simply faithful to the Lord. And because of that, everybody knew and could see that there was something extremely special about Daniel. Not only Daniel, right? We keep mentioning Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. For 20 years, I think I said it wrong. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were three other guys like Daniel that were brought. And, we don't want to skip those guys too, because I think one of my favorite examples of this theme, God providing those who are faithful to him, God opposing the proud, but giving grace to the humble, as we see in Proverbs, is really back in chapter 3. We kind of glossed over it. This is under King Nebuchadnezzar again. And I don't know what it is with these kings, but all of them kind of fell under the trap of this pride where they just wanted other people to worship them, And I guess, power corrupts, ultimate power corrupts ultimately. Like, isn't there some kind of a saying like that? And so these guys are kings over kings over kings. Like, they have these massive, huge kingdoms. And I think they get to the point where they are like, man, what else is there? Like, I can't capture any more people. I can't get any more gold. I know I'll set myself up as a god and I'll have people worship me. And in Daniel chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar makes this image of gold 90 feet high and 90 feet wide, okay? So it was this enormous statue, this huge image, and he set it up in plain sight of all the province of Babylon. And then he summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, all other officials, every single official. He called them all together to the dedication of this image that he'd set up. So they all showed up and they had him, and he had them stand before this thing and worship it. The herald loudly proclaimed in verse 4, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship it will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace." Now remember, this is King Nebuchadnezzar. He's the really intense guy. He was the one who said, if you don't tell me what my dream is, you're going to be cut to pieces and your whole houses are going to be thrown down. So in this, he's got some decree. Whoever does not fall down and worship this image that I've set up will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. And so there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these guys are also faithful men of God. They're people from Jerusalem who has been brought in as slaves to Babylon, and they want to maintain their relationship with God. So they just go about doing what they've been doing all along. They just go home and they worship God. They worship Yahweh. So all these other guys, though, all these other governors and satraps and advisors, they go to the king and they say, didn't you set up this decree? Didn't you mention that anybody who doesn't fall down and worship this statue will be thrown into this blazing furnace? And he says, yeah, I sure did. And they say, there are some Jews whom you have set up over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. Furious, enraged, this is like, probably red-faced and his veins were sticking out of his neck. Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Now remember, this is Daniel chapter 3. This is before Daniel chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar had kind of had this this revelation as he was driven mad out into the forest. This is before he actually acknowledged Yahweh as God. So he says, what God will be able to rescue then? And I love this response. I think, again, this is one of my favorite examples of this theme. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. They say to him, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Again, pretty calm. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God that we serve is able to save us from it." That's Yahweh. "And he will rescue us from your hand, O king." Love that. That is total faith. If you throw us into this fire, the God that we serve, Yahweh, he's going to rescue you. He's going to rescue us from you. He's way more powerful. But then this is the key to their response. They say in Daniel chapter 3, verse 18, "But even if God does not rescue us, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." I just love this response. Let me read that again. They say, "We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." And man, that is just true faith. I think that's a faith that we should apply to our own lives. Faithfulness in God. I mean, how many of us haven't faced difficult situations like this, where something from the outside is coming in and pressuring us or persecuting us, or there's some difficulty in our lives that we're dealing with, and we know that God has the ability to save us from it, and as long as God's saving people from lions' dens and giving people the visions that they need and things like that, it's kind of easy to praise God. But here they're like, we believe God can save us from your hand, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship other gods. We're going to continue to be faithful to Yahweh, even if he doesn't do what we want. So again, Nebuchadnezzar is furious with these guys, and he orders that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And he commanded that some of the strongest soldiers in the army actually tie up these guys and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, all their clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took these guys and threw them into the furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire?" And his advisors replied, "Certainly, O king." And then he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out of here." So they came out of the fire, and all of the people crowded around to see them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was the hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them, which is incredible in and of itself. First of all, they're thrown into this fire that was so hot it killed the people who threw them in there. But they come out, and their clothes aren't singed, their hair isn't singed, and they don't smell like fire. But the even more amazing thing, I think, that kind of gets glossed over sometimes, is they were unbound. The fire, or the 4th person in there, freed them. All right? They were free. They weren't bound any longer. And I think that points right back to our faith. And when we put our faith in God, we might go into situations in this world, and we might feel bound. We might feel like we don't have any choices. We might feel like we're faced against a rock and a hard place, and there's no way for us to get out. And yet, when we're thrown into those things and we trust God, we actually come out free. Whether, like in this case, we walk out unsinged, unharmed, unscathed, if you will. Or, like they said, even if God doesn't save us from the fire, we're free in worshiping the one and only true God. Then Nebuchadnezzar said in verse 28, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any other god except their God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, again, be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Again, he's pretty intense about all this, but I absolutely love the fact that Nebuchadnezzar recognized something special about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and recognized something about their God, because he even says right here, no other God can save in this way. And again, I think that's one of the, in my opinion, the best example of God sustaining, lifting all those up who humble themselves before him. So I know there are people out there right now today who are dealing with difficult times. I know there are people listening to this podcast right now that might feel like they have no choice, that they're bound. I know there are people out there right now who feel like they're in a hopeless situation, who maybe are standing at the edge of a fiery furnace, or standing at the edge of a pit of lions, and they feel pretty hopeless right now. In fact, I know a guy who's working through a super heavy situation in his life, and he is kind of in a lion's den. He's in a fiery furnace, and it doesn't seem like there's any good solution. It's kind of a lose-lose for him. And I just want to encourage the people that are in that situation right now through the book of Daniel. There are so many examples of God lifting up those who put their faith in him, supporting those who put their faith in him, whether it's in difficult situations that they're dealing with, or it's other people kind of coming against them, or even if they just feel like they're all alone and the whole world is out to get them. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble and the faithful.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of just a verse from Isaiah 40, starting at verse 28. It says, "Have you not known, have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the heavens and the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint."
Amen.
And so, unfortunately, that is all the time we do have here for today. I really enjoyed looking through Daniel here this month. I thought it was great seeing just a message of being propelled from just like a dark place of hopelessness to somewhere where God is taking care of us, And kind of on that topic, we're actually going to be ending our series here on the Old Testament. This will be our last episode we're doing here. And next time we'll be moving into the Gospels with the New Testament. So I think that's going to be a pretty exciting time. We've been covering a lot of dark days for the Israelites for what seems like a really, really long time. And so finally we get to get into some of the good news, the Gospels. I'm pretty excited about that.
Do you know what the word gospel means?
I do not.
It means good news.
That's great. That's awesome. That's awesome. That's even better than I could have ever hoped. So next time we'll be starting the Gospels. But like always, guys, if there was anything that we said here in this episode today that you weren't sure about, that you disagree with, that you wanted to double check us on, please shoot us an email, send us a message. We'd love to talk to you, clarify some stuff, or hear if we got something wrong. We're not afraid to admit that we're not perfect.
I'm perfect.
Oh, are you perfect? Okay. That makes one of us then.
I better, what did we just say? God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I better get myself off this.
We should practice our humility, maybe.
We should pray over this.
Maybe you want to pray us out?
Yeah, let's pray. So gracious Heavenly Father, Lord God, I just want to thank you for the book of Daniel. I want to thank you for all the examples of places where, Lord, you faithfully look out for and give grace to those who are humbled, whether humbled by your hand, humbled by life itself, or they humble themselves. Lord, you're gracious to those people. And so I ask that your grace and mercy would flow over each and every one of us. In Jesus' holy and precious name, amen.